Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everyone, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we're going to take a look at one of the most important sort of history lessons, really, in sports history. This isn't really about a game, and it's not about a championship, and it's not about a particular player. This was about the labor battle, the courtroom fight, and the arbitration ruling that forever changed not just baseball, but all of professional sports. So today we're talking about the birth of free agency in Major League Baseball. And I hope that doesn't sound too boring to you. This is a great history lesson about all the sports that we enjoy. So hang in there with me, okay? Because if you grew up in Gen X like I did, you probably remember the explosion of the big contracts that kind of started, I guess it's all relative, but the money that they make now, of course, doesn't relate to at all how they were paid in the 70s and 80s. But if you grew up like me, and especially in the 90s, you remember contracts probably blowing up. We grew up when all the sports that we watched, you could pretty much count on teams staying together for the most part. I mean, there's always exceptions, but most guys I talk to from Gen X say, man, I remember when rosters pretty much stayed the same for years, right? And until the mid-70s or late 70s, that started changing. It didn't change as fast as you see it changing now. Guys coming and going all the time. It was a gradual thing. But at least back then, even when this started that I'm about to talk about, even when free agency actually started, it still seems like there was a little bit of a gradual change where superstars weren't necessarily hopping teams, as much as they do now. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about how free agency actually happened in baseball, because it really led to changes in every sport. So yeah, we've lived through it all. We've seen the players changing teams. All of a sudden, it seemed like when we were younger, we've seen the bidding wars for players. We've seen the salaries skyrocket. But for a century before our time as sports fans, none of that really happened. Players were essentially owned by the teams, which was kind of the problem. So yeah, basically back then, the teams, they pretty much just owned the players, okay? So, and right now we're talking specifically baseball, okay? So yeah, the players are essentially owned by the teams, and they had no freedom to choose where they played for a century. The system that controlled them was called the reserve clause. Now, I didn't know any of this. If you knew it, good for you. You're going to hear it again. But for the rest of us, this is good information. Why was it that teams stayed together for so long? Well, here's your answer. And what changed? Here's your answer. To understand how free agency was born, let's look at the late 19th century and how baseball, Major League Baseball, structured their contracts. The reserve clause first appeared in 1879 for the National League, which was the early days of professional baseball, of course. At the time, team owners were worried about something they called player jumping, and you know what that is without me telling you. If a player had a great season, another team would just come in and offer him more money and lure him away. What does that sound like? Sounds like the NCAA right now. As a matter of fact, it's good timing to make that point. The NCAA has screwed up college sports so bad that they're functioning at the same level that pro sports functioned in 1879. Sounds about right to me, but I digress. If a player had a great season, another team would just come in and offer him more money and pull him away. So the owners, they wanted stability on their rosters. Okay, so they quietly inserted a clause into player contracts that allowed a team to reserve a player's rights for the following season perpetually. Now, I'm not an attorney, but that word perpetually is important, because that meant that every year the teams had the player's rights for the following year. So every year that you completed this contract, it just automatically rolled over into the contract for the following year. So that meant there was no way out of it. And at first, it was just supposed to apply to a handful of players per team. But the result was they ended up doing this to everybody on the roster so that they could maintain control for everybody for every year. Even after a player's contract expired, the team still owned his rights. If the player didn't like the contract offered, he only had 3 choices: sign it, retire, or sit out a whole season. Now, players became free agencies under the following conditions: only if he was released or his contract not renewed. Otherwise, teams could trade you at any time they pleased. So let me back that up for a second. If a player didn't like what was going on, he could only sign his contract yearly, retire, or sit out an entire season. And the only way the teams got rid of players was that, and made you a free agent so that you could sign with anybody. The only way that happened was that if they released you or refused to renew your contract. Okay. Those are kind of like the 5 things that could happen to you in totality. Players could not negotiate with other teams. They could not test the market. They could not shop their services to other teams. They were effectively locked into one organization unless, like I said, they were traded, released, or not renewed. So for decades, the system worked exactly the way the owners intended. It kept the salaries low, it kept the players under control, and it created a baseball economy where ownership held all the leverage, of course. So for nearly 100 years, a reserve clause was the law in baseball, but eventually players began to push back a little bit. And in fact, in 1953, they challenged it. Players challenged it, but it was upheld in court in 1953. So in some ways, that doesn't seem that long ago when the teams still had complete and total control of their players. However, the turning point started in the 60s with the rise of a players' union. Apparently, before 1966, the players had at least started a union, but it didn't do much for them. But in 1966, the players hired former steelworker union economist named Marvin Miller. That didn't make a lot of sense. Marvin Miller was a steelworkers union economist. He worked for the steelworkers union and did a good enough job that Major League Baseball hired him, or the players hired him to run their union. Marvin Miller. He was brilliant, strategic, and fearless. He understood labor law inside and out. He understood collective bargaining inside and out. And he quickly recognized that baseball had far more leverage than they actually realized. At the time, now this was the mid-60s, the average Major League Baseball salary was around $19,000. Even the star players were underpaid relative to the money that was generated by their sport. These guys worked jobs in the offseason that I've mentioned many times. NFL guys, Major League Baseball guys, they didn't come home in the offseason and train the rest of the year. No, these guys sold insurance and sold cars and built houses and farmed and all kinds of things. They needed money. It wasn't that high of a paying gig back then. So this Marvin Miller guy, he began educating players about their rights, and he negotiated the first collective bargaining agreement. And the collective bargaining agreement is basically just a big contract that says, here's how you're going to treat your players, and here's what can reasonably expected from them, and so forth. It's the rules. It sets out the rules. And he secured something incredibly important back then for the players, which was salary arbitration. But he knew that the goal was going to be much, much bigger. The real target of what he was doing was to get rid of this reserve clause. So he zeroed in on that immediately. And the first man to challenge all this that really gets the credit for it, and you've heard his name before, was an all-star center fielder, Curt Flood. Curt Flood was one of the best defensive outfielders of his era. He played for the St. Louis Cardinals, where he won 7 Golden Gloves, and he was a 3-time All-Star. and he helped the team win 2 World Series in the 1960s, okay? And by 1969, Flood was a respected veteran on the Cardinals team and around the league. And something happened to Curt Flood that changed the game, okay? It would change sports history. After that season, the Cardinals traded Curt Flood to the Philadelphia Phillies. But Flood did not want to play for the Phillies. He didn't want to go to Philadelphia. But under baseball's rules, remember that reserve clause? Under the rules and the reserve clause, he didn't really have any choice. But instead of reporting to the Phillies, Flood did something almost unheard of back then. He wrote a letter to the commissioner of baseball, a man named Bowie Kuhn. In that letter, Flood wrote words that we still hear about to this day. He says, "I do not feel that I'm a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes." And then he did something even more shocking. He sued Major League Baseball, and that lawsuit eventually became a famous Supreme Court case, Flood versus Kuhn. Flood argued that baseball's reserve clause violated antitrust laws and unfairly restricted players' freedom. Let's think about how that would be today. What if LeBron James or somebody got traded and just flat out said, "I don't want to go there"? I mean, it's a pretty big issue, okay? So imagine back then when you didn't have the ability to protest these things, how many headlines that would have made, right? So Flood's case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1972. And the ruling, well, Curt Flood lost. The court upheld baseball's long-standing antitrust exemption and the reserve clause. The whole point of all this was to get rid of the reserve clause, and it actually survived. But even though Flood lost that legal battle, he still changed the conversation and the strategies from the legal side. And the most important thing he changed was the attitude among the players. They realized now that Major League Baseball was actually vulnerable and could be challenged. And the union, therefore, began looking for another path to victory. So after Curt Flood lost in the Supreme Court in 1972, Marvin Miller and the Major League Baseball Players Association changed strategy. They changed tactics. If they couldn't destroy the reserve clause in court, maybe they could do it through arbitration. So they began studying the case, or began studying the clause very carefully, the language in the clause. Because, every word counts in a legal document. It just does. And they actually noticed something really interesting. The clause, the reserve clause, allowed a team to renew a player's contract for 1 additional year if he refused to sign. But what if that 1-year renewal was the only renewal allowed? What if the clause didn't allow teams to renew contracts perpetually, right? Forever. If that interpretation was correct, then players might become free after playing just that 1 extra year after the contract ended. The union just needed the right test case to see if this would work or not. And so 2 pitchers came out and provided the opportunity to find out. All right, I hope you're still with me. So Curt Flood challenged and lost. Major League Baseball the Players Union regrouped. So now they're testing this reserve clause not being an every year thing, but just being a one-time thing. So the key figures for this next strategy were 2 pitchers, Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally. Messersmith pitched for the Dodgers and McNally pitched for the Expos. And during the 1975 season, both of those guys did something bold. They refused to sign their new contracts. Instead, they played the entire season under the automatic renewal provision, which, keep in mind, the teams assumed to be perpetual and forever, and the players were trying to test whether it could be a one and done. And so at the end of the year, the players' union filed a grievance, and their argument was very simple. The reserve clause, in their interpretation, only allowed for 1 renewal year and done. After that, the players should be ruled free. And the case went before an arbitrator named Peter Seitz. And on December 23rd, 1975, Seitz delivered one of the most important rulings in sports history. So let me pause right there and let you know that there are some legal things we need to understand really quickly. We all know what a trial is, and Major League Baseball had already won in trial all the way up to the Supreme Court level. What a arbitration is when two parties agree to hire together a third party who's impartial and basically acts like a judge. It's all done in private. It doesn't have the same restrictions and public record and things like that an actual legal trial would have. And so you're agreeing to go in and let this person decide on this matter, and you agree to let that happen. And it's mostly to keep it in private and things like that. So you can do that. It's less expensive. It's quicker, so forth. So arbitration just means maybe it's a judge, maybe it's a law firm, whatever, but we hired somebody to decide this for us. So on December 23rd, 1975, Peter Seitz, acting as the arbitrator, delivered one of the most important rulings in sports history. Seitz ruled in favor of the players. He concluded that the reserve clause permitted only a single 1-year renewal, and once that year ended, a player was free to negotiate with any team. And so just like that, the system that had controlled baseball players since the 1800s collapsed. Owners were, of course, furious, and so they appealed the decision, but the ruling stood. Now, I don't know how appealing an arbitration actually works. I don't know if you hire yet another arbitrator or what. I don't know. I didn't look that part up. I did not know that before I read this note. But the ruling stood, and the reserve clause officially died at that point, and free agency arrived in its place. With the reserve system now gone, owners and players had to negotiate a new structure to take its place. So now the players union had its chance to really pounce. So in 1976, Major League Baseball and the Players Association signed a new collective bargaining agreement, which of course is the rules of how they're going to run things. And that agreement created the modern free agency system. So here's the outline of the new rules. They're not the same to this day, but this is the first set of free agency rules they came up with. Players would become free agents after 6 years of major league service. Salary arbitration would begin after 3 years. So players could demand a trade after 5 years of major league service, and if not traded, then the player could become a free agent. And teams could also now compete for players on an open market. So this structure, which was 50 years ago, still forms the backbone of Major League Baseball's labor system today. Now, these particulars have changed, and some things have gone away and some things have been added. But this was the first attempt to give the players a shot at going out and getting the best deal they could get, right? And once free agency arrived, baseball economics changed immediately. One of the earliest stars to cash in on all this new free agency stuff, and you probably have heard this, it was Catfish Hunter, the pitcher. He got a head start before the 1975 Seitz ruling. Hunter actually became a free agent in 1974 after a contract dispute with the Oakland A's. So he signed a massive deal with the New York Yankees, which shocked the baseball world, which is how I remember him as a Yankee. I didn't realize there was drama about him becoming a Yankee until now. And then came another signing that actually got a lot more headlines, I would imagine. Reggie Jackson joined the Yankees in 1977, which I do remember. His contract made him one of the highest paid players in baseball. And in a classic Reggie fashion, he backed it up with some big-time postseason heroics. And within just a few years, player salaries began to skyrocket. In 1975, the average Major League Baseball salary was $44,000. Now, that's up from the $19,000 that I mentioned to you back in the 50s or whenever it was. By the late 80s, many stars were earning millions per year. And the economics of all the sports changed forever. The baseball collective bargaining agreement, it was changed again in 1981, and it changed again in 2011 with even more specific free agency rules. And free agency just didn't change only baseball. It changed all professional sports. Other leagues began adopting similar systems. So player unions across sports gained leverage. Okay, athletes were no longer bound to just one team for life, and instead they could pursue better contracts, better opportunities. And it all traced back to a handful of individuals like Curt Flood, Marvin Miller, Andy Messersmith, Dave McNally, Catfish Hunter, Reggie Jackson. Those guys challenged the system, and they won. So for Gen X sports fans, the effect of free agency was everywhere, right? We grew up eventually watching superstar movement become normal that way. I mean, it just wasn't always a lot of team hopping until, to me, it got the worst in the 90s. But players like Reggie Jackson and Nolan Ryan was the first player I thought of when we were talking about Major League Baseball and free agency because, I so clearly remember him in two different uniforms, the Astros and the Rangers. And of course, he started out with the Mets, but I remember him being a big free agent. Ricky Henderson, of course, playing for the Yankees and the A's. Dave Winfield. And of course, much later on, you've got Mark McGwire going to St. Louis, Pujols going to St. Louis, etc. But, going farther back, Barry Bonds changing teams and so forth. All these guys changing teams and blockbuster type deals, the idea of the athletes having control over their careers really became the standard for sports culture, okay? But before the mid-70s, that wasn't the case. That freedom just didn't exist. And that's why I think we Gen Xers in our minds, we think, oh man, these teams stayed together forever. And they did. Like I said, some superstars changed, sure, but some people had the opposite effect. Some superstars refused to leave. They did everything in their power to stay in that one city, and then the team just moved people around them. So, that's the other side of the coin. But either way, free agency was changing rosters. That's why when I was really, really young in the mid to early 70s, I remember my Dallas Cowboys team, it seemed like the roster was 90% the same every year. I know it wasn't technically, but it really, the core to that team and all other NFL teams stayed together for a long, long time. And you're starting to see why that changed in the 80s. It's because all of this aftermath and the results of what happened in baseball. So it took a little while for some sports. By the way, in hockey, I would think Wayne Gretzky, moving from, of course, Edmonton to Los Angeles was a big deal. So I do remember that. So for us today, free agency, it's just one of the defining facts of professional sports. It's how championships can be kind of bought. If you can load up on enough superstars and make it work in the salary cap or the luxury tax era, and a lot of teams catch a lot of flack for that, somewhat buy titles now. Look what the Miami Heat did with their triplets many years later. That's just the way it is now. We older guys have to get used to the superstars hopping around so much. It drives the off-season drama that things like ESPN depend on, really, in the NFL and so forth. It creates massive contracts that dominate headlines. Of course, as we sit here right now, Shohei was probably the last huge contract in Major League Baseball that got all the headlines. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in these contracts now. But it isn't just about money. It's also about these guys putting in their time and having the right to go play elsewhere if they want to. It's about player empowerment. And, it all points back to 1975 and even before, with that one arbitration decision that changed that word or that thought of something being perpetually renewing to one and done renewing. And I think that's pretty cool. And the sports world has never been the same since. It's really kind of interesting how we take some of these things for granted. This discussion reminds me of the fact that I was very well aware in the early 90s when the NFL went to a salary cap. So some people you younger guys, you don't realize that it wasn't that long ago the NFL was the Wild West and you could just pay all you wanted. But now there's a salary cap, and so these business type things that are also labor involved, yeah, they involve money, but it's also about the player movement. So that's why this changed everything. And so if you wonder today how guys have the freedom to hop around after the end of every contract and sometimes can force their own trades before the end of the contract, you can go right back to this happening back in the day, because the other side of the coin was having absolutely no ability to move around. So there you have it. That wraps up the discussion about how we got professional free agency for the most part. It started in baseball, and then all of these other leagues kind of joined in. But yeah, it just came down to a couple of attempts to get organized and to go strategically after the language in the agreements, and they finally found their way in, and I think that's really, really interesting. So if you enjoyed this discussion, hey, there's more baseball coming your way. We've talked about baseball already at the professional and college level. We're going to talk a little bit high school baseball coming up, and we're going to stick with baseball for a little bit, but we'll throw some other things in there this spring and summer here and there when I find something interesting. So that's it for this week. I really appreciate you spending 26 or 8 minutes with me, and I hope this was a good history lesson for you about how we got free agency in our professional sports, and how we have it in the NC2A. That's a whole different topic. But it's, this thing happening in the NCAA is reminiscent of some things we've seen in pro sports before, except, of course, the NCAA kind of went crazy with it. So that's it for this week. And this is your host, Sean Enos, and we'll be back in a week to talk about some more baseball. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.